And now for our first session, Power and Progress, setting the vision for public interest AI. Please welcome Vilas Dhar to the stage.
Thank you. What a great opening, Antonio. I really appreciated those comments.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot to take in today. There's a lot to take in when it comes to AI, and we're going to be looking at AI application in a number of areas. And I think it's great to open with you because you can really help us having a bit of a eagle-eye view when it comes to many of these issues. We've known each other for a while. Our organizations have been working together on a number of projects. And I remember you telling me, I am an optimist about technology. And when I asked you, what do you mean? You simply said, because I'm optimist about people.
That's right.
Now, we are at a critical moment in time, right? We're seeing, yesterday we spoke a lot about this tidal wave of populism, the rise of authoritarianism, democracies literally sliding back in terms of numbers as well. And at the same time, AI is obviously accelerating its growth. Institutions, bilateral institutions, are really shaping the future of democracy. What does he mean to be an optimist around technology and people at this moment in time?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thanks again for this warm welcome. It's so easy to try to have a conversation about AI that will take us down into the rabbit holes of algorithms and bias, of water and power, of the tropes that are being pushed as if they're the most important things we should talk about. But my conversations about AI very rarely start and very rarely end with the actual technical facets of AI systems. They instead start from what we're trying to accomplish in this whole conversation about human innovation, not just in the tools we build, but in the systems, the structures, the societies we aspire to create. A friend of mine has a saying, and I just love it. She says, we've spent most of the last few years stuck between hype and horror. On one side, the kind of breathless anticipation that somehow these things we build will fix our human challenges, will somehow make us more democratic institutions or more just or more equitable. I've never in my life experienced a tool that has helped a person be more of any of those things. The horror, the almost kind of terrified conception that somehow these tools will kill us all, will destroy our conceptions of a broad and just society, will be out of control, that somehow in our imagination we can create something that will overwhelm us. Fine. We, I think, are probably all very cognizant of these conversations. I think my great struggle is there's not enough space for the third, for not hype, not horror, but for hope. To understand that as we have innovation and we're able to do things that are incredibly creative, as we build tools that expand our sense of what's possible, we also have within us a moral sense, a conscience, a duty of care that means that we can use these tools to do better things. Now, I'm not naive. I don't believe that this will happen simply because we build more things. I think it can happen if we start with intention. If we start not with what the tools are capable of, but with norms and values and rights and principles, with a contextual awareness of what we could do and a hope for a future we could build. So it brings me back to your question, Antonio, am I optimistic? I'm not optimistic about what happens in labs in Silicon Valley or in corporate boardrooms by themselves. I'm deeply hopeful about the fact that if we could get our act together, and I think we'll spend some time today talking about what that means, we could actually do some of the most incredible, creative, innovative things we've ever done in shaping a new society.
So for this to happen, governance has to work. And you are part of the advisory body on AI for the UN. There was a big announcement a couple of weeks ago. You wrote an interesting piece on Time magazine that highlights the creation of this scientific panel and the group that will follow. I have a very candid question, right? Given the failure of bilateral institutions that we've all witnessed with wars that are still ongoing, why do you think this time we need to have hope that bilateral institutions will be able to solve this?
Look, it's so easy, and I even saw it yesterday with many of our speakers, to feel like because the world faces challenges, we have no responses. That multilateral institutions that have been under attack for decades somehow no longer matter. And yet we see evidence every day that they do in incredibly mundane things like how we think about air traffic control around the world or the lanes of shipping, the treaties that guide cross-border transactions and allow us to have systems of justice that work around the world. There are so many different ways that multilateral institutions still continue to define the very fabric of our society. Okay, maybe that's a little too boring for this crowd. Let's talk about specific successes. We have in the room today Gabriela Ramos, an incredible leader who, in many ways, has shepherded the creation of the first multilateral treaty about the ethics of AI. An accomplishment that I don't think could have ever come from a single institution or even a single sector without a common sense that ethics, particularly if the most important technologies we've ever built, have to be a broadly human endeavor. They have to happen through a consensus-driven process. They have to happen in ways that bring together exceptional scientists who are building these tools, those market leaders who are trying to bring them to profit and to distribution, and to those who are invested with the credibility of governance. Nation states, policymakers, and potentially some of these institutions that we love to malign. We went from that incredible achievement to the work that's happened just in the last year. For 193 countries to come together and accept the idea that these tools need to have a scientific basis of engagement. That we need a panel not of tech company CEOs who maybe are out there trying to boost stock prices, but people who are really at the forefront of building these tools, who can speak credibly about the opportunities, but also about the risks, who can talk about safety not with a breathless sense of existential dread, but rather by saying, this is what we know these tools can do and what we anticipate they might do soon. How do we build that into the decision-making priorities of policymakers? And finally, as you mentioned, this other thing that happened at the UN, maybe not so covered and maybe not so known to this group, but the creation of the first multi-sectoral dialogue that brings together people around the world that are struggling with these questions and issues to not ask, what do the companies think we should do? Or even, what do governments think we should do? But as a whole of society, how do we protect the interests of communities and people and ensure that we're building a playbook of the best practices that center those interests as we go into an incredibly uncertain future?
So bringing together the voice of civil society, the voice of the scientist, how do we move from a framework to something that has that holds power to account, that has accountability? Is that even possible? Is that even right? Do you think it should be done or not? Or do you think will stifle competition or innovation at this moment in time?
There's so much in that question, Antonio, and I think it's worth pulling it apart. Let's start with why we think we need multilateral frameworks to begin with. And I'll give you an example that comes from a very narrow world, a world of cybersecurity. We're here at the Trust Conference. We have spoken extensively about misinformation and disinformation, and about the ways that adversarial actors have tried to undermine the very foundations of trust in our society, often using cyber tools. Since really the beginning of digital technologies, people have used these tools often in a one-off way. A person, an institution, often a nation state, trying to exploit vulnerabilities. Add into that story the advent of AI, which has fundamentally transformed the power structure of cybersecurity. It's no longer about nation states that can really invest into building these large teams that are incredibly sophisticated in finding vulnerabilities, but rather generative AI that allows, unfortunately, individuals and small groups to act as if they were these highly capacitated nation-state groups. You have a much broader threat environment. You have adversaries who are much lower in capacity individually, but using AI tools can operate at a global scale. And we have infrastructure for defense that's designed for a future, for a past that existed 20 years ago. It's one particular sector where you see that we need new approaches to thinking about how AI is transforming national defense, intelligence communities, and security. But those things are no longer regionally bounded. They're no longer guided by borders and by nation states. They require a way to collaborate among agencies that protect fundamental security, that actually share information with the private sector and the public sector in a way that's not yet familiar. We need new mechanisms and new institutions. So if you take that sense that we are finding across so many domains, from food security and the distribution of life-saving resources all the way through to cybersecurity, that the sets of problems we're facing require new forms of solutions, then you come to one question that I think feels very comfortable. Who is responsible and capable of delivering into that space? And I'll tell you, I'm not sure I always know what that answer is. There are plenty who will raise their hands. Often the first hand raised is the private sector, right? Market-based companies that say, we'll handle that problem for you.
Leave it to us.
But as we've seen over and over again, they might handle a significant part of the problem, but when it's no longer profitable, there are those who will be left out. The second mandate is government, right? That nation states, that even regional and local governments have a responsibility to drive the frameworks that allow these tools, technologies, and vulnerabilities to be addressed. But we continually see that they can't do it alone. For all of the reasons that have become tropes, right? That technology is faster than regulation, that our policymakers aren't competent. These are critiques that are easy to lob and not always fully justified, but let's take them at face value, that government alone can't do it. So what's left? What's left, I think, is the critical conversation that we've been having over the last 2 days. The idea of what Roberto Unger called the institutional imagination. The ability to look at the forms and functions of what our society needs and have the moral courage to say we will step forward to design the mechanisms and institutions that will address it. So I'm not here to proclaim that the institutions of multilateralism we have today work particularly well and that we should continue them, but rather to ask the question, if we gave up on them, what else is left? And who will stand forward to say, here's a vision for how we take what we have and make it better for the world around us? Antonio, the funny thing here is we're on a day about AI. And you'll note that in the last 10 minutes, we've barely talked about AI. I think this is the fundamental truth that we so often ignore. All of these conversations are about how we make decisions together as a society, about what we value, about whether we're willing to bring words like dignity and participation, shared equity, about the distribution of economic goods into a conversation that so long has been diverted. We've said we live in a world of scarcity. We can only distribute in a particular way, a way that results in inequality, and that's okay because that's the reality we live in. What's changing now is not a conversation about the tools, but if we said we can move from scarcity to a world where a whole bunch of new possibilities emerge, how are we going to make decisions about what that future looks like? And I can't think of a way we do it without bringing to the table the whole of society.
So today we're going to be talking about AI as a public interest tool and AI as a public good. Where do you see progress in this infrastructure really being built? You know, France is obviously doing a lot of work in that space. In an article that you recently wrote, you spoke about Chile, for example. Where do you see examples of, good stuff that's emerging when it comes to AI, considered as a public good and invested as such?
Yeah, let's name the falsehood right up front. The falsehood that's so easily accepted is only the private sector can lead in innovation in AI. And it's an easy story to tell because you've got all these headlines of fantastical and somewhat ridiculous $500 billion investments here and statements standing next to world leaders there. And we lionize these private sector leaders. But quietly, meaningfully, sometimes slowly, we have an entire alternate story emerging. One where we're seeing the beginning of meaningful public investment into creating AI infrastructure. You mentioned a couple of these examples, and I'm so fascinated by them. At a convening that, again, UNESCO brought together of ministers from across Central and South America, the seeds emerged of something that has now become a GPT, a LLM, that's designed entirely using Spanish language inputs, led by governments across South America, led in part by Chile, that is publicly available and freely usable for people who want to build entire enterprises on top of them. They don't require the use of a foundation model that comes from a private company. To me, that's exactly what you're talking about. Public infrastructure that's driven by public institutions for the public benefit. We're seeing it in the context of compute capacity, where for so many of the world's businesses, the only way you still can get compute access is to go to the private cloud. Well, what about those public sector institutions, nonprofits and social enterprises that are trying to use compute capacity to train models on problem sets that don't fit into commercial categorization? Problems like, how do we make sure we sustain and support our mangrove forests to provide a seawall against rising seas? How do we build climate advocacy and climate campaigns to ensure that pollution doesn't affect the most vulnerable in our communities? These are stories that need access to public compute, that need subsidized access to the underlying infrastructure that lets them build these models at scale. And data. You know, I've told you this story, Antonio, but just to share with this crowd, one of the most poignant moments I've had recently is meeting with the minister of a country who was very proud to show me the incredible AI advances they had made. But let me frame that for you. She wanted to show me a system that aggregated all of the information they had about surface and subsurface mineral rights across the country. A system that was built on data that had been collected across 50 years of commercially paid for surveys. She could tell me using the system exactly where you might find cobalt or zinc or rare earths or gold. She could tell me how much it might cost to extract per kilo or per ton these minerals and get them out for shipment. It was an incredible advancement in using AI to drive the economic development of the country. And yet, I asked one additional question. I said, you can show me where the gold is and where the zinc and where the copper is. Can you show me where the safe, potable, healthy drinking water is in terms of surface reservoirs or subsurface ones? And she said, you know, we actually don't have any data about that. It's never been collected. I think in that story is the germ of truth of why AI needs to be public infrastructure. Because companies who are trying to extract are likely not thinking about how they fund the studies that allow us to understand the most life-saving and dignity-creating interventions that you might build. That has to happen through public investment, and we're beginning to see that. Through innovations like Climate Trace, which we deployed a couple of years ago with Vice President Al Gore and a number of nonprofits around the world, that has become the world's largest public repository of emissionality data. The data that measures carbon and methane emissions from every kind of activity you could imagine, from industrial manufacture to shipping to human and agricultural use. And this system that is publicly created, run by nonprofits, but used by private industry, lets you do a few things. It lets private activists go out and say, what's happening in my community? How do I make sure that we advocate for cleaner practices from the local power plant? But it also allows a private sector business to ask a question like, because we have responsible AI practices, work that you and the team here have pioneered, we're going to use the system to ask a question. Let's say I'm a steel importer. How do I make sure that I look at the ways that steel is produced around the world, and I want the system to tell me at exactly the same price point, without my spending a penny more, how can I cut my carbon emissions by 90%? And using this incredible data store and the predictive capacity of the system, a business like that can actually figure out how to have a meaningful social impact without having to incur any additional pricing. This is a whole set of stories about public infrastructure at scale, and I could tell you 100 more. I won't bore you. You can tell how excited I get about them. But the story here has to be, this can't be 100 different examples that operate independently. But rather, when does government and the public sector step in to say, we're going to invest in building this as platforms of creating public compute, public data, and training people, and creating the incentives to build these tools in open source ways that actually further a vision of social transformation. This isn't a diatribe against the private sector. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Because the only way we do this effectively is to bring private companies into this infrastructure as real partners. Something that's been pioneered in India with the idea of an open stack that actually starts the process of creating this infrastructure and then allows private sector innovation to build on top of it, to build the kind of interventions that create a really robust ecosystem. There's a lot here, but at the end of the day, the biggest takeaway from all of this is reject the premise that AI innovation can only happen inside a small handful of companies. We've actually got proof points galore that when human innovation's distributed, we can actually build a much more robust and valuable AI ecosystem than even the $7 billion numbers that you set up at the top in the increase of GDP.
So as we build this infrastructure for public interest AI, you gave some really good examples from India to Chile about applications that are happening and that are funded by the government. We are obviously in a context where governments are under immense pressure to do structural reforms. Cash is not exactly lying around. Do you think the private sector has a responsibility to co-fund those initial investments, especially in countries that don't really have the ability to finance those infrastructure from when it comes to public interest AI, especially in thinking of the global majority countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to be a little bit provocative with you. I rarely want to talk about the responsibilities we have to put on the private sector. I think the quote is, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, right? Let the private sector do what the private sector does incredibly effectively. Innovate, build, and create distribution mechanisms for great products. And let's not offset the responsibility that you and I, that the public has, to building public sector interventions by saying the private sector should fund it. Because look, if we believe, and I do, that we have a moral obligation to ensure that the benefits of AI are shared widely, then we know what the tools are to do that as public sector institutions, right? They're to create regulatory environments that incentivize dignity-based behaviors. That instead of merely thinking of regulation as a way to limit what companies do, we should be thinking of government action as a way to set whole of society visions of what's possible when we think about public research and investment and infrastructure and the creation of new ways to share that across the world. I'll give you an example, and I think about this really in the context, Antonio, of moral courage. I think about President Macron's incredible commitment at the AI summit in February to invest public funds into something like Current AI, an initiative that you'll hear more about. I know that Anne Bouvereau, who I admire deeply, and Martin Tisney are here for your next panel to talk about how we build a global capacity to take AI potential and make sure it's distributed across the world. An initiative that might reach 2.5 billion or more euros of public capital being used to build capacity in communities in the global majority and around the world. These aren't fairy tales, and they're not some idea of what might be possible. This is work that's being done by real leaders when they sit down to say, this is actually a part of the core mandate of governance. Okay, now let me come back to your question around the private sector. Do I think they have a responsibility to do this? Well, it doesn't really matter what I think, because unfortunately these companies are driven primarily by shareholder and stakeholder interests. But I know that one thing that we have to do is stop thinking of these companies as homogenous, hegemonic, single institutions. Private sector companies are made up of incredible engineers and product managers and lawyers and all kinds of folks who bring moral compasses to their work. And I think when I spend time with these companies, with their boards, with their executive teams, and with their frontline workers, I hear from them honest and human interest in doing the right thing. Sometimes the shape of these organizations and the dynamics of how they're supposed to operate in the market end up silencing those voices. And so I think the responsibility, if you want to put one on companies, is to allow workers, employees, and the people who are part of these organizations to express with real genuineness and sincerity what I think we all know to be true. That pursuing profit only at the exclusion of purpose isn't a way to create a future that works for anyone, much less all of us.
I want to talk about an old-fashioned, perhaps matter these days, which is diversity. How is diversity important? You know, your background is in engineering, of course. Is it actually important in developing an AI that reflects the characteristics that you just described earlier?
Yeah, well, let's start and we'll go up the ladder, right? The basic truth and the obvious one here is there is no system we'll ever build that without representation of language and interests, of values and beliefs, is in any way going to be universal for us. I remember, and Antonio, I think you were with me at a presentation we gave at the UN a couple of years ago, where I was on stage and sitting next to the president of one of the major tech companies, and with almost no sense of irony, he was very comfortable to say, the LLMs and the AI systems we are building represent the very best of humanity. I had to stop him, and I promise you well, maybe I'm a diplomatic person, maybe I'm not, but I had to stop him, and I had to ask the question, how can you believe that systems that are trained on the, let's be honest, the Reddit ranting, but also a bunch of other things, of maybe 1 billion people in the world, of English-speaking, rich, global north majority populations who talk about the issues and contexts that they think about, could possibly represent the best of an 8.5 billion population in the world, of communities that have thousands of years of cultural wisdom, that have real lived experience at the front lines of vulnerability, that have found creative ways to build new innovations that have transformed the world around us, and just aren't even a part of your system. So let's start there. Let's think about it as inclusion, not as a matter of some sort of far-flung value principle, but because it simply makes the systems better. The incentives and the drivers are deeply aligned for companies and for governments and for you and me to know that if we're going to rely on these systems to shape decision-making for the whole planet, they should be represented, and they should be representative of the things that the planet cares about.
And when you speak to those companies, to those engineers, do you think this is a view that they share, or is being
I mean, I'll tell you again, I think the truth itself is unshakable. Like, who can disagree with that? The challenge is when you get to the practicality of it. When you get to what the market requires the company to do and what maybe a few tech company CEOs, and we can talk about that more, are defining what they think the purpose of these institutions are, versus the fundamental truths that if you want to build better products, you have to have better inputs. So this is, again, where I think the sense of public sector infrastructure begins to play a role. Because if the companies won't do, if we all agree that this is necessary, if we can have a public conversation, and I'm sorry to use this term again, but it's so important, right? If we can elaborate what our morals are, what our values are, what our principles are, and then we say to the private sector, please deliver against this, and they fail to do so, rather than tilting at that windmill, why don't we go out and say, what's the public alternative to this story? What does it take for us to build a credible and viable way to shape the future that we've agreed is the one we want? Well, the only thing I think that holds us back from that is imagination, is a willingness to commit to infrastructure. is to believe in institutions, is to actually create a shaped vision of what that future could look like. And we started on a conversation about hope, Antonio. Like, again, I'm not here to say, hey, there's a pie in the sky version of the story that I'm telling you. I'm saying this is happening. It's happening quietly, it's happening without attention, but it's happening in ways that are affecting hundreds of millions of lives. I think the responsibility we have is to say, well, if it's happening, if we have a proof point that it's possible, then why aren't we flooding in capital and investment and political will in order to set it up as the bulwark against those very dark forces that you described yesterday, against the erosion of trust, against the attacks against democracy? I mean, look, I have a very soft spot in my heart, as you know, for journalism and the media, right? I think it is maybe the most important institution of many important institutions. Rather than bemoaning the decline of the institutions of the last era of journalism, why aren't we figuring out and innovating what the next generation should look like?
What's the role of philanthropy in all this? You know, we've spoken about private capital, we've spoken about public capital. Today we end the conference with a session on the role of philanthropy in addressing some of the critical issues that we've been dissecting across these 2 days. Obviously, you lead a major philanthropic institution that is focused on AI. Where are you investing your philanthropic capital, and where would you like to see more of your peers investing in?
Yeah. Antonio knows how to get me riled up. I do lead a philanthropic institution, and as you know, I've been deeply critical of philanthropy. I think in many ways, the ways philanthropy still works is a 20th century model, right? Make a bunch of private sector money, put it in an institution that gives that money away, and everybody pats themselves on the back and goes home. I think there is a more fundamental role for philanthropy that is deeply aligned to what we've talked about today, which is to be one of these institutions, not just of creating social resilience, but of shaping a shared social vision for the future, where capital becomes a tool as part of a broader process of supporting and sustaining public trust. So I think philanthropies need to move in a direction of, one, certainly making more capital available, of freeing up trillions of dollars of assets that are locked up in philanthropic endowments, to move away from a practice of funding pilots and projects, and instead considering how do we build platforms and infrastructure at scale, of becoming not merely reactors to the vulnerabilities that are created by the actions of the private sector, but to become drivers of building a vision of what alternate mechanisms look like. And finally, and maybe most importantly, as we consider and continue to talk about the technology-driven transformations of our economy and our society, to be at the forefront of those transformations rather than following behind, to be early adopters, to envision the creation of public tools at scale. I'll give you one very specific example. I think if we look across the social sector, whether it's media and journalism or across the direct delivery of services, the responses to malnutrition and poverty and war, there are such few and limited cases of enterprise quality technology solutions that have transformed the work of the sector. In many ways, the organizations that we rely on to be the most effective bulwark against vulnerability get the scraps from technology that's created for the private sector. They have to go and buy tools off the shelf and figure out how to jerry-rig them together so that they might be of service. One provocation I might leave with you is, where is the investment that builds the capacity to create enterprise quality technology, AI software and tools that are designed for the social sector to be able to serve the public at scale? That's something that could happen with investments on the orders of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And with a group of amazing foundations, we're beginning to pioneer this. And you've seen some recent announcements about foundations that are coming around to funding in AI. I think this is the future, and I think we'll see some really meaningful progress on this over the next couple of years.
Vilas, as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you.
What a joy. Thank you.